This session is titled Sustainable Self-Sovereign Agents. Just to give a quick introduction about how it all began. So Adrian is the first to really bring this up, and he has been talking about Gold Button, and Gold Button is kind of a badge where the operators, the sources, the data using services, and the person would all kind of see in a different way, and it would sort of it would ensure that the barrier to entry for an operator or even a self-hosted or self-sovereign one is low enough that people have enough meaningful choice in choosing who gets to represent them and their personal data. And today, this is kind of where we are right now. We're in the middle of creating a specification. You can take a look at it if you want. And today we have 3 sessions or 3 different parts. The first half hour is going to be moderated by Alexis Hancock, and we'll be talking about use cases. And I'll hand it over to you, Alexis.
So a couple of very quick organizational things. Kalia is actually going to launch us off. I hope that we stick tightly to the 30 minutes so that we're polite to all the people that Chris and I have invited, so that everybody gets their chance. I'm not the moderator at any of the 3 sessions. It is up to the moderator of the session to decide how many audience questions and how much to torture the other people that are online. And with that, Kalia, you wanted to say something about...
Actually, I think that I really liked Chris's introduction of what his idea of a sustainable self-sovereign agent. I think this is an exploratory realm, and I'd love to just hand it over to Alexis and get into the use cases.
Oh, and people, please introduce yourselves before you start as to who you are and what you do.
Yes, I'll kick off the moderation for the first half hour, going over different use cases. And I am Alexis Hancock, as Adrian said. I come from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I am a staff technologist there. I've been there for 2 years, and I have been assisting activists and educators and the like with security trainings for close to 10 years now. So I would like to get started with, let's see, patient health records, talking about doctors as a fiduciary in that use case, and I'll hand that over to Adrian.
Okay, I'll do this in 1 to 2 minutes this first use case is something that I think we all know pretty well, which is how do we digitize a vaccination card? It's also obviously very important these days. There are 8 things that are important about a vaccination card, digital, when it's made digital, and also on paper. Number 1, it's used for adverse event reporting. That's probably the most important one. Number 2, it is a asymmetry in terms of access to different things, whether it's travel or getting into school. Number 3, if the vaccination has a second dose, you have to keep track of who needs the second dose. Number 4, it's to manage disparities of access to the vaccine. These are not in any particular order. Are the right people getting the vaccine that should be? Number 5 is trust, making sure that people trust the vaccination process and aren't shy. Number 6 is you want to be able to do policy research for effectiveness. Number 7, you want to have universal access. Kids and people who are poor and undocumented all need to have access to the vaccine. Number 8, there's a patient identity component that has to be digitized. And number 9, there's a long-term storage or a lifelong storage component. And so, as Alexis already said in the title, the thing that makes this use case unique relative to the other 2 is that it involves a fiduciary. The doctor is somebody that is going to sign the credential. They have a registration number saying that, you know, they've been trained to do the vaccination, and they are a fiduciary because they are chosen by the patient. They're not forced upon the patient. And that's my intro to this use case.
Thank you, Adrian. I assume let's just go ahead to the second use case in terms of talking about and connecting these things together with city as a sovereign agent. So I will hand that over to Oliver to explain that further.
Sorry. Did you call for me to start, Olivier?
Yes, please. If you could just introduce yourself
no problem.
quickly, and then
Okay,
we
no
can
problem.
talk about your case.
So in 2 minutes, so I'm Olivier. I'm CEO of OneCube, which is my data operator, and we work with our main focus is with cities all over Europe that are building a mass platform, mobility as a service platforms, where cities will allow citizens to aggregate data, mobility data, in order to help them to reduce traffic, to reduce carbon footprint, to optimize their travels through the city, and to push for modal shifts, for abandoning the car to more sustainable transports. One specific use case I can detail, you can see it all over Europe, it's a high-level use case where you will tell your city, you will justify to your cities that you use sustainable transportation, like bicycle, like scooters, like car sharing, and so on. You will tell this through your data to your city that will subsidize your travels, offer you discounts on other city services, and this way influencing you to be greener in your mobility. And the specificity of this use case is that the city becomes, in a sense, the operator of your data. The trusted third party is the city. It's not. It's the middleman between you as a citizen and multiple or private organizations, which is great in a sense because the city will represent you against many organizations, but it's another form of governance, a specific form of governance if the city has such a big role in the ecosystem. I'm done.
Thank you, Oliver. Going over to the third use case, we were talking about business incentives around adopting human-centric principles around this concept of SSI. Samantha, are you on?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Thank you. I'm Samantha Matthews, and I'm the founder of Loci, and we're a learning management system that works with other learning management systems or kind of uniquely connects to facilities management by creating a course builder for locations. And what the whole system is designed around building locations zones. So fire zones are how buildings are designed. And they're also how safety is managed in terms of responsibility. And so we designed a system that allows any location that's managed by a liable party to essentially ensure that every single person that comes through their doors, be it a guest, a contractor, or a full-time employee, receives some sort of information about that building. So we can connect in with a security system or a HR system so that anytime somebody is coming onto a property, they receive a training. And so that training becomes is verifiable. We know that people have seen, for example, an exit test is one of our products, or they've done their germ safe course. These are gamified courses that are less than a few minutes to play, but that prove certain understanding of concepts within that building, be it germ safety, health, where eye wash stations are to exits. And what this does is it maintains a threshold. So you can report an occupancy to your city officials and to the fire officials. And what happens is in our use case, The city inspector, the fire inspector acts as the fiduciary. They sign our course. So every time a new course is created, it gets signed by the local inspector. And so that they know that the course can't be changed. So everyone's going to be going through this course. They've already done the course. They trust that it's the best possible training that could be given to any person that's in there. And that signed course lives in our system as people go through. All of their data is handled by us, but the long-term vision for a company like mine is to hand over control of this sort of intermediary system to a like WorkSafe BC. We created the system that works with a shipyard in Vancouver called CSPAN, SEASPAN, because specifically around the BC's org book, which is an excellent use case that's actually operational in British Columbia, that allows all of the businesses that are registered in the province to be available and searchable on a ledger. What we're doing is having this, because BC is happy with trusting the fire department, and CSPAN's excited to not have to handle this data and wants to be able to prove to their insurance broker without having to hand over a bunch of documentation in a public way that they're going above and beyond in their safety practices, that they're looking after their people. So what we've done is created a use case in which verifiable knowledge is signed off. The system of verifiable knowledge is signed off by the fire inspector. And if the enterprise or organization maintains a threshold of training, they get a credential issued to the verifiable organization network, the BC org book. And that allows, that sort of becomes this public identifier to other people that they work with, other enterprises they work with, that they have above and beyond safety practices. The long-term goal of this is to lobby for reduced risk and underwriters. So this is ultimately an insurance product, but we wanted to create a system that would allow for there to become this like collaborative trust between private and public entities that worked with the human at the center for advocating for their safety and their knowledge, but not getting into the messiness of too much personal data. This to me is a first step towards adoption in the bigger picture, because a company like mine can come in, set up a trusted system, and then hand that over to something like an intermediary, like a WorkSafe BC or something like that.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thanks.
So hearing these different use cases and hearing about how using these agents in different factions and different, obviously, sectors, private, public, especially within the city portion, how would you describe the biggest challenges to these use cases? What would be the biggest challenge of you completing something like this, and what would be a barrier in that way? Any of you can chime in on this. I just wanted to hear personally too, as like what would be the main challenges in this way, and what success would look like.
I can speak to the challenges we had to overcome. Like we're creating a system of trust from three very disparate entities. Like people are kind of like checking the boxes and showing up to each other when they need to be compliant, but they're not actively working towards improving a system. So you have to be the one that's willing to go out there and bang on the doors and sort of ideate something that will like incentivize each kind of person you need to make a bigger system work. And so I think it really takes people that are like, have their eyes on a bigger picture, that are willing to sort of trudge around to all the different players and make those connections. Because that's ultimately like, there's no one that's really incentivized to do that unless they're thinking that way.
The biggest obstacle in my use case, the healthcare use case, is explaining what self-sovereignty means to both the individual and to the doctor and to the institution, the pharmacy, let's say, that's going to actually stock the vaccine. Nobody understands the term, and I think Olivier and I were talking about this in the city sense. So people, human centricity at the core of sort of my data principles is not a defined term. self-sovereignty is a well-defined term. It means you don't have a contract with anybody else, right? There's no privacy policy, because if you're self-sovereign, it's like in Bitcoin. If you have a Bitcoin wallet and you're using it to do Bitcoin things, there's nobody you can hold responsible. Nobody's going to go and restore your password if you lose it. There's nobody you can go crying to. It doesn't matter what country you're in. That is a very difficult concept to get across to all three parties in the healthcare use case. Yeah, that's the problem.
I just want to do a name check really quickly. Have I been mispronouncing your name? Is it Olivier?
That's great. You can say Oliver.
I don't want to mispronounce your name though. Like
it's Olivier. Olivier.
Okay.
Okay. So the biggest challenge for us, I would say, when I started my journey in the VRM, my data, self-data world 10 years ago, I was just seeing organizations on one side and individuals on the other side. And then within the city use case, you get this new player in the middle that feels and that is legitimate to help with data, but they have a specific role, a new kind of role, a trusted third party that will represent a group of individuals. They represent the public sector, but they will aggregate public and private sector data. And it's a new political role for the city, but it's also a more complex governance. It's harder than just organizations and individuals. And what we see in at least in Europe, I'm not so sure in the US or in Canada or elsewhere, but in Europe, even just in Europe, you got the different cases where sometimes cities want to get much more involved than in other cases. The governance, they want to take a stand and say, okay, we will protect citizens, we will help them with their data. And for other cities, it's more about convenience, I think, for traffic jam and so on. So it will depend on the city. There is no one solution fits all, and it makes governance complex. But I think we are tackling here the real difficulties: public-private sector, who rules in the ecosystem. And as we were discussing just before the session with Adrian, I talked to some cities that said, okay, you propose my data operator to us. It's great, you represent the individual, but who will govern you as a my data operator representing the individual? And I could have said I didn't, but I could have. But same for you. You're the city. Maybe in 10 years, you will have aggregated so much data that citizens will be scared about your position in the ecosystem. So we need to think about powers and counter powers for every kind of character in the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. I'll add one thing that was a challenge was not being super deeply entrenched in the data community every day, like building a safety product, but being very passionate about this community. I felt caught off guard this year by the learning that like the project that BC Gov had done was kind of a pet project and there wasn't really anyone maintaining it. And I think that happens a lot in this space. People make something powerful, they don't really realize the impact of it, and they're kind of like going on. And to me, it was like, oh my God, like our BC government has done something huge. This is a big step in the right direction. And I like getting all the documentation for it and building it out. But it's like no one's there to support the continuation of that. And like for someone like me who's working with private enterprise, that feels like having the rug pulled out from under me. It's extremely discouraging.
Thank you so much for talking about the challenges around what it means to be like a self-sovereign agent and like actually to explain that definition to people. in my experience, I've seen people not necessarily worry about the self-sovereign agency part, but how much the government and how much the private sector were actors within the system, and like what are their responsibilities and how transparent they were. So I want to talk about that some more, about how can transparency help these use cases. Infrastructure, definitely. I definitely hear the pet project use case a lot. Usually when talking about specifications and in particular, and how so well thought out a certain conversation will be, and then actually seeing it in practice has been quite a quite a bit a large gap for me there in terms of conversation. So I want to talk about that some more, about what have you done in your use cases to show that transparency and kind of pull back the curtain.
You're muted, Adrian.
I'll start with quickly. The healthcare use case transparency problem was made very obvious in the US for the last 9 months as people struggled to avoid political influence on the case counts and supply chain problems and everything in between, disparities amongst different populations. And there was a lot of back and forth about, there was a change at one point in time saying the hospital should report to the White House instead of the CDC, for example, literally. And so what that pointed out to people is that there is no governance, no pattern, no control over how personal information should flow, either directly from the patient or from the doctor that is acting as the fiduciary of the patient, and what that problem is. Now, in our particular thing, the thing that Chris mentioned earlier, and we put a spec up in the chat, which we can refresh, what we did, we introduced the idea of a community that is self-sovereign. So in other words, the way people in a stress situation pick a gang, to protect themselves, or pick a club, or form a union, or sometimes form a cooperative, or join a church. So we actually introduce not just the human-centered, the self-sovereign agent of the individual, but we also introduce the community that is picked and is self-sovereign, just like a gang, can make its own rules as long as they don't get caught. And that allowed us to sort of aggregate the power and to introduce transparency, whether the government, for instance, liked it or not. So in other words, when Sam talked earlier a little bit about how the fire inspector is a fiduciary, they are a fiduciary, but of the city. They are not chosen by the individual business. They get the elevator inspector or the fire inspector that they're going to be assigned. And that is a different fiduciary role than, for instance, a patient picking a doctor or a person picking a defense lawyer when they're facing the court.
Thank you, Adrian. Unless Samantha or Olivier had any other questions, I want to dive into this a little bit more in terms of transparency. And I want to talk about what are the privacy concerns that you may have heard of, like a city acting as a fiduciary or a private company acting in the system. On my end, I have done a lot of research around immunity passports in particular, what that looks like, and a lot of the conversations around privacy as a citizen. So I've seen a lot of like themes of like, documentation minimization and, minimization of sharing of personal data. I kind of want to get into that a little bit more, where we talk about what other privacy concerns you may have heard besides those two things, and how have you tried to, I guess, get some buy-in in terms of the actual citizen themselves, because the power dynamics, as Olivier said, was, there's the government structure, and then there's the individual, and that amount of power that you feel as an individual can vary depending on how you're structured by your government or determined by your government about who you are as a citizen. So I kind of want to talk about more of those privacy concerns.
Mhm. I can speak a little bit to what I noticed through working with the shipyard that I found to be really unique and why I sort of doubled down on safety, which was unions. They're everywhere and there's a lot of them. Like the shipyard I work in, for example, has 14 unions. And something that happened recently was, they work in a lot of confined spaces. They're building ships, and the heat and the air has to be monitored at all times. And there was concerns in working in the summertime and with these new workers coming on. So they were concerned about washing people's bodies. They ordered all these vests that track biometric information, and they're still sitting in their boxes because the union never approved the data policies for that company. That kind of stuff happens every day in large enterprises, and I think it's money that people don't like to waste, and it's genuinely frustrating for people who are trying to make, like, safety managers who are really trying to do their best. I see hubs and agents being adopted first by places like unions because everyone has a financial incentive to do so. You have something like WorkSafe BC, which is or some sort of, workers' compensation board. These are bloated organizations that are never going to come up with a way to handle these things themselves. So I think there's a real opportunity for people who can show the transparency of how their product works in terms that a union will understand, and go speak to the union leads. Don't talk to the enterprise, because if you go get on the union side first, you're going to have everyone. You're going to be like, hey, guess what? Your union is cool with us storing their data. And then now these $100,000 worth of vests sitting on your shelf, you can use them. These problems exist everywhere. And I would highly suggest that people look, if you're building in this space, just go look. All of the incidents are reported publicly. You can just look up in any sector why unions are turning things down. And a lot of them are because of personal data.
All right, it was a few minutes ago. I'm sorry, Olivier.
No, but maybe I can share on the mobility city sector. So if I go back to my the use case I was exposing about incentives for green mobility. So we've got systems for sharing your car sharing data, where you will just share certificate for car sharing data, but not the trips to the city. So it's about all the techniques I hear about are about minimization to address the issue of privacy, because some people fear about the city knowing about all your whereabouts. If they get all your trips, there is a risk. So, for instance, with this incentives for green mobility use case, you don't need to know. The city doesn't need to know all the trips, but just the information that you made some. That's enough for the use case. So I would say that it's obvious, I know, but minimization. There are many ways to minimize data you share, but data is still very useful for the specific use case you have. And so it's interesting techniques about this. And also, and I'm trying personally to push this idea, is that transparency and independence over consent for data sharing is important, but it's less. This point is less obvious at the city level or transport operators. And from what I see in the ecosystem, they kind of now, since GDPR, they all track consents inside their information system. But the idea of having consents for data sharing, which means consent between organizations, independent of them, is not well accepted yet. It means less power for a public transport operator or a city. It means more power to the individual. So even the city would be kind of put aside on the consent question. So that's kind of a battle. Is consent in the hand of the individual, or is consent managed through the platform of the city directly? There's no clear answer to this. Every model will be tested, I suppose. But yes, I see two. So I see minimization. What was the problem? And transparency and independence of consent on the other side.
We're calling it at a half hour here, but I think we can slide in one question, hopefully. So I did see a question from the audience. This is directed towards Sam. Would the reaction on the data collection have been resolved by personalizing the collected information? I assume this is the context of what you last said about the unions and the buy-in from them. You're muted, by the way.
Sure. So just pulling up that. I think that it would have been resolved if anyone had any comfort speaking to these things. I think it was just a really poorly managed interaction. And I think that the company had no way of handling the data. The union had no way of handling the data, and the data was necessary for the product to work. And so that sort of, from the reports I read and from the frustration from the safety manager was that there was nowhere that could store it sufficiently.
Thank you so much. Adrian, you had something to add?
No, Kalia is next.
All right, there, take it away, Kalia.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexis. So we just heard 3 really interesting use cases, and
Kalia needs no introduction.
Thanks, Adrian. The focus for this half hour is to continue the discussion, talking about the sort of issues and tensions between self-sovereign entities and fiduciary entities. And I wanted to open up actually by inviting Bill Wendell, who made a comment about a use case that he's interested in. He talked about it in chat, but I wanted to ask him to just name that out loud so we could hear it as well.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So the use of the word fiduciary in the real estate industry has a long court-tested meaning, and it's to use your expertise to help a home buyer or a seller. As I understand it, and I'm still trying to parse this out, and that's why I attend everything that Adrian and Kalia offer, is how does that translate to information fiduciaries and the kind of trade-offs that Olivier and others talked about? Just to give you a scale, in the real estate industry, it's $100 billion a year fees, and some consumer advocates suggest that changes in how fiduciaries act could result in $30 billion a year in consumer savings.
So the point that you're making is sort of saying that we have in law an understanding of what fiduciary relative to like a transactional universe is, like real estate, or potentially like a lawyer, like their cousin, but what does it mean to be an information fiduciary? And that's a really great question. So do any of the panelists who've spoken or any of the participants here want to share their thoughts on the answer to that question?
Well, briefly, again, in the healthcare use case, we have the example of buying your drugs in Canada, where they might be 1/3 the price of what it is in the US. And whether, how are you going to get that advice and that prescription that is then recognized in Canada? And we see this tension that we saw in the first half hour Is it the FDA that decides whether you can buy your insulin in Canada? Or is it your doctor that you choose? So you get to choose which doctor as a fiduciary. And so I think that's just one very simple example. Bills is basically the same sort of thing. When you introduce choice and transparency at that level, that's where the efficiency comes from.
Yes, Sam, maybe, or
Yes, go ahead.
okay.
Oh.
So no, I can share.
Go ahead. Go.
So I'm not an expert on fiduciaries, but I see it as a responsibility representing the best interest of the person. And the thing I see with cities, I do not know if it fits the description with cities, but it's a complex landscape based on regulation. In Europe, it's either at a European level or at a national level. So it makes a very complex regulation landscape. And this responsibility cannot come only from the innovators and the proposition that we make. You have to take into account specific local regulation. But in the end, the spirit that they propose, the cities, is this: we will defend the best interest of the citizens. But it raises the fact that this is a city. It would raise some questions like what is the counter power with this new role from the city. And what I've seen, it's not everywhere, but what I've seen in some cities is the will to create exactly this, a new role for the city. Handling data, and especially personal data, will need a new category. Okay, now before the city was handling transports, education, different kinds of services. This is a new service and a new role, and we will have to define the rules attached to it. It's not clear yet. We need use cases, we need experience to understand what is the best role of the city. What is too much on one side, and what are the opportunities on the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like there's a real opportunity for businesses to, or for especially on the side of employers and employees or contractors. Like I see a lot of issues around people being able to prove they have certain certifications and trainings and work. And I think that the places I see the most impact is kind of in that middle ground, public-private sector. The cities, in terms of having like, I'm wondering if based on your comments there, Olivier, if you feel that the RFP process for governments is an issue, because to me, it seems that a lot of cities, the way in which they go about buying their technology is through such a way that technology companies don't know how to sell through. And there's this real gap there that I've noticed, which is like that side of, it's almost like the chief information officer needs to be like have some sort of watchdog or something created for what technology is bought, because doing it through like RFPs, like everything else, seems like where there's a huge problem that I'm seeing in the municipalities I've talked to.
In Europe, we see RFPs as maybe the best way to implement everything we are talking about, self-sovereignty, personal data management, etc. Maybe it's a practical way to implement these new architectures, human-centric architectures in the economy, because if you only count on private companies, you will always face a kind of selfishness and
Mhm.
closeness. And maybe if, for instance, Europe or a country wants this to happen, this human centricity, maybe RFPs, and especially with cities, is the best way to achieve the goal. So I don't see it as a threat, but more as an opportunity. But the problem is that people doing those, issuing those RFPs have to understand what they're talking about.
Well, that's kind of what I mean. It's like there's no one at the higher level that
Yeah.
knows how to explain what to put into an RFP. So they just put out this thing that's like,
But
this,
I
right? So
know.
it's without knowing what to ask for. There's not really this consulting
Yes.
happening at that city level.
But the problem is, look at us here, and through the whole My Data conference, we all have many ideas, many concepts. We are confronting them with not that much concrete feedback from the field. So it's even hard for us to agree on how to do this. I work with a huge lab in Europe with Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and a part of Germany. And I'm French, so I work with French players. They are just seeing what we are talking about, confronting ideas and testing. We will know more in a few years, and I think it can be a kind of quick as soon as we get some concrete feedback.
Thanks. I'd like to ask Alexis with her EFF hat on about what some of the concerns that you have with what, you know, in terms of the idea of information fiduciaries, like how are you thinking about them in terms of your role as a consumer advocate?
Well, I'm thinking about it in two ways. Systems that haven't been created yet, that these new terminologies in this field is coming into, and systems that already exist. So there's established relationships. There was a use case I was looking at in the UK that talked about doctors being able to use certain technology around being able to verify who they are, that was kind of related to this, and being able to confirm with the NHS or the national healthcare system that they are in fact able to practice in this system and help expedite things, right? So those were like power dynamics and established relationships that I can see in the future for other intermediaries, right? And as far as like information fiduciaries on a consumer level, I've been doing research mainly in the healthcare arena, as you already know, Kalia. You've seen all my all my writing, all my rants. But I try my best to understand what the other entities are coming from, but from a consumer perspective, if it's a new system being rolled out, like such as like vaccine confirmations or vaccine passports or certificates, however this gets worded in different ways. From the consumer's perspective, I want them to make sure that the power dynamics that are in play don't get exacerbated or in any way, shape, or form in terms of in a negative way, and the consumer gets empowered. I've seen cases and dabbled in what I can see for the consumer themselves or a citizen themselves interacting with different institutions. And so that's what I'm mainly focused on is it exacerbating existing inequities? Is it exacerbating the government's role in that person's life? And is it increasing it in some way? And if it's increasing it in some way, is it beneficial for them as a citizen? And will it escalate any sort of issues that they may have as a citizen if they're undocumented, if they're poor, if they're marginalized in any way, shape, or form? What does this relationship look like? So when a lot of people sort of just concede that certain parties will always be in danger of certain things, right? Outside of this conversation. But I want to make sure like whatever technology gets rolled out, whatever certifications get rolled out, that I speak on that voice of, okay, let's take a step back and, you know, not necessarily focus on convenience or streamlining, but focus on the relationships here. And are the relations going to get better if this gets rolled out, or will the relationship get worse? So that's what I focus on mostly, especially in my research, because I care a lot. I was raised in environments where, you know, I've seen people get state benefits and such, and they had so much documentation to give over, like pay stubs, you know, going back 6 months, and then you have to put in all this documentation. And I can see where maybe some of this technology, talking about information fiduciaries in that way could help, like minimize that sort of interaction in that way. So that's like one of the use cases I saw, like in my own imagination, right? Because I think this takes a bit of imagination, because it's not something that's normally streamlined. Especially, it's kind of like there's different use cases with different private companies here and there in pockets. But for obvious reasons in the US, a national rollout doesn't make sense because we don't have a federal data privacy law. And I don't think until we get a federal data privacy law that those, like, it's going to have to be in pockets. So that's where I kind of look at, and instead it was like Europe, they have the GDPR. So that's kind of affected, you know, the government level and relationship and in the private sector as well, and like what that relationship looks like. So that's what I look at with my hat. I hope that answers that question in
Yeah.
some way.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think what you're saying is really interesting in terms of like the government's, sorry, can you just, never mind, continue. I lost my thought.
It's okay.
Well,
I mean, that was pretty much all I had to say.
I was going to ask you, Alexis, in terms of the use case that Olivier put forward, where the city, like my understanding of the use case is that the city asks citizen to share their transportation data with the city so that it can help coordinate both sort of their personal transportation needs, like mediating between like potentially like the buses and the Uber style services and the scooters, or like there's a range of transportation options.
Exactly.
Like to me, I get a little nervous, like, oh, you're going to share that immediate real-time data with the city and they're going to be a good actor. And like, so I'm curious, like, I'm curious about if that feels like a realistic potential information fiduciary in the North American context.
In a North American context, I would think that, how can I put it? So there's like real-time data that I think that would be the most, I rank data collection, you know, in a certain way. So I think real-time data would be like high risk in that way, in its own way, versus traditional collections of quantitative and qualitative data from citizens, like surveying, you know, and if and what is the goal, right? So I would think that a city talking to a citizen saying that, you know, we want to increase access to public transportation. How like how is that serving you currently? And so maybe focusing questions around access. Are you able to get to work? How's your commute? Times of commute. I think more traditional collections of data could help there before we step into more like escalation of like real-time data in some fashion, right? So that's where I get worried in that sense, where I think that, you know, I think traditional surveying could help a lot there. But if there's another way that the use case that Olivia had talked about, where it can serve access, where, you know, there's like this opt-in, you know, maybe like a smaller example study, like within the city, not necessarily a full rollout. I imagine citizens may or may not opt into that, but what that could look like as far as like using certain different technologies, such as like maybe say they do like a one-time transaction of like sharing, or is it continuous? Obviously the data minimization part, like I believe he said they just need that rides were taken versus the amount of rides that you had. Thinking about it in that model, I think helps a lot because it gets the city to ask a question, what exactly do you need? and what are you trying to solve? And if the questions and what are you trying to solve don't match up, you could possibly put that in different models of traditional surveying or whatever technology you're trying to roll out. But that has to be the main question. Like, what question are you trying to, what are you trying to solve, and what is the issue? And so if for some reason the questions that you're asking isn't talking about what you're trying to solve, then you've already started collecting more data than you need. So I can see how it can go wrong. I try my best as an EFFer to not go too dystopian. I can think of all the worst cases, but I try my best to of what could potentially happen. But I would like to know the intent of that particular city's, questioning, and what data you're trying to collect and what goal are you trying to solve. So sometimes I think, traditional means is fine in certain cases and may not need an extra step in. But in other cases, I would need to see what the goal is and, what exactly is being used. So that's my thoughts on that when it comes down to that particular use case.
Thank you.
Just to complete this, I would like to share an example. So I do not live in the US, but we've got a great example of mobility data and cities in the US, which is the city of Los Angeles and Uber scooter data. Uber was not willing to share. It's not personal data. It's statistical data. But the city of Los Angeles asked for, through policies, forced Uber to share statistical data that were beneficial to the whole city traffic. And there you've got a very interesting role for the city. Even in maybe it's different. I understand that it's different in the US compared to Europe. The trust you can put in cities. But here you can see the beneficial role of a city as a bargainer with big data sources like Uber and others.
And I remembered what I was going to say about just the adoption of information fiduciaries. To me, where if you can look and find risk, there's going to be incentive. And so finding like places like, to me, I just moved, and so I went through like giving all my personal information to a bunch of random strangers on the internet, and that's kind of an example of like, well, where's the most fraud, and can you build a business, a repeatable business, or just in those places? Like if it becomes standard in the places where we all know there's a lot of risk for some sort of intermediary, to me, that's where long-term adoption comes from, is you just start to expect it in certain places where you're just bleeding your personal data to someone, and then you build it from there. The awareness builds. Right now, it's like people don't even realize that their data, like they're like used to Siri telling them it's time to go home from work or something, but like they don't know how their data is being used or could be used for them. And so I think more than anything, if you look for where there's risk and protection that can come in from a place like a city or something like that, create that incentivization through trying to reduce risk. That will always be how I see adoption actually taking place.
Right. And I just
go ahead.
I just wanted to add, like even with currently, I think within, California has rolled out, right, like a COVID tracing app in particular. So these are the types of things I've been tracking, is like these tracing apps, and then like applications that are being developed around vaccinations in particular. That part of adoption, I feel like this app wouldn't really work out in the state, just because of the fact that, like you said, people are used to telling their phone, like Siri, telling them it's time to go home from work, right? And so I think in the US in particular, I'm going to keep shouting federal data law until it happens. Hopefully I just put it out in existence. But that's the piece there that I think that's missing for a lot of local governments here, state level governments, is because of the fact that there's no layer helping the consumer understand that, okay, this company cannot sell your data, full stop, or this company is not allowed to do X, Y, and Z after they've obtained your data. This company has to destroy this set of data when you ask. We don't have that here federally. So it affects the relationship, and it affects proposals here a lot. And I have to think about that all the time, where it's like someone will have a proposal around something. And I'm like, well, it would be nice if we had a federal data law that actually had some baseline of what privacy looks like here in the US. Right now, privacy in the US is just, oh, we didn't have a data breach. Don't worry. That's pretty much privacy in the US. That's it. And that's not necessarily that's not what people or the EFF defines as privacy for the user. That's not talking about our agency here. So a lot of that affects a lot of solutions here.
So I had Phil Winley, who's in our I think of all of you purchase. Phil Winley had something he wanted to share.
Yeah, so Adrian and I were having a kind of a private chat, and he asked me about PICOs. Some of you know, I've been working on those for a long time, back when we used to call them personal clouds. Although that's not what PICO comes from, but nevertheless, we've recently been updating them so that they are Hyperledger Aries compatible agents. And I recently published a blog piece about how they can work in the Internet of Things. I'm just going to share a picture if I can.
Great.
So I'll put the link to the blog in the chat so you can go read it. But the point here is that each of these little wallet things is a Pico-based agent. And why I'm saying Pico-based agent rather than like just a wallet you might get from Trinsic or something is that Picos run rules, so they're each customizable and automatable. And in the context of the discussion we're having right now, Alice is selling her truck to Doug. So they've created a sales relationship, which means they exchange bids. And so they have a private channel. So in this case, Alice and Doug both have a Pico they control. So you can think of that as a self-sovereign agent, but they're also linked to their banks over a DID-based relationship. And the banks are running their own agents. And so in that sense, the bank is going to get information about this sale from both of them. Well, I've labeled it credit unions, but nevertheless, they're going to get information about the sale. They're going to have to act as fiduciaries. So there's no way you can just make it all self-sovereign and have it all and do the things we do all the time, like talk to the DMV and talk to the insurance company and talk to your credit union. So there has to be rules in a fiduciary sense about how these parties work together, but there can also be self-sovereign interactions where these parties are controlling their own data and how that gets shared. One interesting aspect of selling the truck is you can see that the truck is also a Pico and a Hyperledger Aries agent, meaning it has data, credentials, relationships with lots of parties, etc. When Alice sells it, she doesn't want all of her data that might be in the truck going to Doug, but she does want to keep it. And so part of the sales process would be having this agent be smart enough so that it can actually create a shadow of itself that contains all of the information that Alice might want to keep, like her trips and her maintenance records and other things, but passing on to Doug the thing that she's willing to let Doug have. He might, for example, want all the maintenance records for the truck. So anyway, I just think the reason I wanted to share it is just because there are interesting ways to think about self-sovereign and fiduciaries, and the Internet of Things really kind of brings that all out. And that's why I wrote this blog post, is to talk about all of that.
Thanks for sharing that, Phil. That's like a helpful addition to our use case, our use case buffet that we've had this session. Adrian has a point he'd like to make before we shift to the next 30 minutes.
So in Phil's example, there's a concept that has been bouncing around in my data called API neutrality. And I don't think we have time to get into that now, but API neutrality is in Phil's diagram there. It's which of those entities, and he showed 9 of them, I think, altogether, are able to substitute a self-sovereign wallet agent, the orange thing, for a fiduciary one, and which ones are not. So if my data, or in general government or whatever, were to introduce API neutrality as a concept, then one way to think about it is that anybody who is subject to API neutrality cannot forbid one from introducing a self-sovereign agent as opposed to a fiduciary one. And I just wanted to make that point, because we talk about these agents as if, it means something to people, and, I'm trying to make it concrete.
Mm-hmm. So like one of the things that I'm in hearing this discussion is that there's a distinction between self-sovereign, like we're talking about these sort of emergent potential future ecosystems, but there is 2 types of agents that people might use. One is a fiduciary, where they're trusting a business entity or another person. Like there's conversations about guardianship where parents would manage their children's credentials, right? But that you would trust another entity to do the help you manage the agent. And they would need to do so in ways that were, as a fiduciary, good for you, not just good for them. And then there's the potential for people to literally control it on their own computers at home without anybody or any entity working on their behalf. And that's and to have fiduciaries in this information fiduciaries in this new way, we're going to have to innovate some new laws and practices and engage with folks whose job it is to help think about the needs of potentially folks who might be at risk for being taken advantage of in those situations. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Chris, who's moderating the next 30 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Kalia. I want to start by showing a demo that Adrian and we created for, it was actually for the identity, internet identity workshop that I think Kalia and Phil are co-owning or co-founders of. But this is kind of the way we see the meaning behind. It's just 24 seconds, and it's about this person who's trying to rent a car, and there you go. She's picking about her car, and she has this option here at the bottom to book with Gold Button. And Gold Button is pretty much her agent. Her agent goes and finds her driver's license, her insurance info, and her payment information, and it gets them all, and then she's done. Right. So this is kind of the way that we see. This is our vision, and here I'll share a link in the chat that is a use case that you can look at to get a better idea of what that is. And Alexis mentioned that you mentioned about what goal that we're trying to solve, and I think that is a great thing to bring up at this point. And I think what we're trying to solve is this issue here on the left. What you're seeing is what's written in the white paper of A New Governance, which Olivier is part of. And it's about separation of powers. And on the right, we're seeing something that is in the Trustee 2.0 document by Adrian. And here it says separation of concerns, but they're both the same thing. And it's about being able to create trust in an ecosystem by having these separations. And the point is to make sure that no small group of organizations or people are able to consolidate and really hold the power in that. And I think the way that I see it is in terms of privacy, there's these threats to privacy that this is something that I'll share also. But you see here, there's these three different types of privacies that are mentioned: threats of information leaks, threats of control over our bodies, and then threats to our power to make our own choices about our lifestyles and activities. And below here, it says here that so the way I understand this first line here is that it's clear on what the negative parts are about not having privacy, but it's maybe not so clear about what the positive parts are. But what privacy does protect is this personal information, personal spaces, personal choices, and protection of freedom and autonomy in a liberal democratic society. And I want to take the viewpoint of looking at what we're trying to do here in terms of ethics. And that's why I've asked Vivi, who wears many hats in many very, very important organizations. But today I want to introduce you to her as she's an ethics researcher. And I think her viewpoint from that point of view is going to be valuable. And so, Vivi, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe share your thoughts a bit on the separation of concerns and what it means?
Thanks. Yeah, it's fantastic to be a part of this really cool session, and I definitely want to follow the example set by the previous half an hours and include as many as you as possible in this discussion. So, like Chris mentioned, I wear multitude of hats, and one of them is an applied ethics researcher. So I work with personal data and its use, abuse, misuse, and different ethical kind of dimensions of what we're talking about here. And I think one of the most important things that sometimes people maybe miss about my data is that it really is about power. And I like this kind of separation of powers term in the sense that when we're looking at personal data and how it's being used or misused or abused, it really is a question of how power is being exercised. And my data, one of the sort of fundamentals of my data thinking is precisely to correct for the current imbalance or asymmetry of power between organizations and people. And I see the kind of separation of powers and separation of concerns as one of those tools with which we can do that, so that we can take an organization like an information fiduciary, and at least on an abstract level, we can say these are the parts which deal with the fiduciary part of data and its management, its processing. And then there might be organizations like a city, for example, who have this fiduciary duty in certain parts of the life cycle of a data or different discrete data sets, but which also have different duties, some which are mandated by law, for example, or by considerations of security. So this is why I think sort of like separation of powers is conceptually really powerful because it allows for us to see the different functions which a complex organization like a city or any organization which might take on this fiduciary role can have.
Great. Thank you very much, Vivi. I think the way that I see Olivier's example, where the city of Helsinki asked him who would be governing him, and I think that's a very important question, and it has to do with this separation of powers. If the separation of powers had existed, then maybe it would have been much easier to answer that. I think in terms of self-sovereign agents, the idea goes to where a person shouldn't maybe necessarily have to rely on another entity. A person should be able to be their own operator and their own information intermediary. And this is actually written in the My Data Principles. In chapter 2 of the roles, the role of a personal data operator, it says explicitly that an individual can be their own operator. And I think what this shows is that I mean, especially from the point that it was written into the principle, it shows that there's something there that's very, very important. And Vivi, as someone who's been around My Data from the beginning, and not as a person from My Data, but I think from just your own perspective, what do you see is as the important part about this individual being their own operator, and anything that you think maybe we might be missing, or that you want to add about it?
Thanks. That's a really good question. And I think, first of all, what I want to say about the My Data Declaration is that it really was created to be a living document, and something that we should think hard and long about and develop and take further. So I think it's good to be also critical of what is there now, in order to collectively learn and just get better at human centricity, at My Data, as advancing this kind of goal that we all share. In terms of your question about individuals being their own sort of My Data operators, as they are kind of described in the declaration, I think it's conceptually important that we define those what My Data calls My Data operators, or what can be referred to as information fiduciaries or intermediaries. It's important that we don't exclude the possibility of individuals running like on their own hardware, their own operators and such. But it's also important to recognize that that is not an option for the vast majority of people. And it's so I think one of the things about My Data that is so wonderful is that it can really be taken into quite a few different directions. I think people running their own operators, being their own operators, and being their own fiduciary, so to speak, is a direction that is really interesting and worth exploring, as long as it doesn't kind of take over as the one and only truth or method of implementing the kind of My Data thinking.
Great. That's really great, because it leads to the point that I was hoping to bring up. And this is actually what I'm about to say is actually the thinking of Adrian Gropper. And he's been talking about how important these self-sovereign agents are for them to exist, right? It's not about having them dominate the market or anything like that. And the point is that even if it's just 1% of the people that are using it, it will keep the balance of power in place. And the term that he likes to use is, he says, keeping them honest, or keeping the others honest, right? And so I think that's kind of the angle that we're looking at it from. What's worrisome, I think, is that if there is too much advancement in the fiduciary operators without being considerate, or I guess without taking into consideration what a single person, as a person that wants to be their own operator, might have to face, then if they get too far ahead, then that could become a potential problem. And if you don't mind, Vivi, I would like to give Adrian the stage for a moment to talk about this, because Adrian, would you be willing, please?
Well, yes, I wasn't planning to, but the net result of this in the context of what we're talking about now is which comes first, governance or standards. And I think this has been a constant issue in my experience with my data, different thematic groups in as long as I've been involved, is and it's not just my data. I see this in PathCheck, for instance, that are doing contact tracing and proximity detection for COVID. It's very easy to rush to the idea that we need to solve the problem first and we can't wait for the standards, but we're going to fix it with governance, either certification governance or other things. And I maintain that it's actually faster to work on the standards first and demonstrate, for example, with free software, without any intellectual property claims, whatever, that you can introduce a community, for instance, or you can introduce a self-sovereign agent, or you can demonstrate API neutrality, and just show those facts on the ground in the self-sovereign context in order to keep the governance people honest. Because as Olivier made very clear, who's going to govern? And as I'll just end with this, Shoshana Zuboff, who coined the term surveillance capitalism and wrote the book, actually basically asked the question, who decides and who decides who decides? And I think that is really the issue that my data itself faces in terms of separation of powers and our concerns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I was just, it's a little bit different. It's a reframing of it on the topic of sustainable self-sovereign agents, and a little bit outside of more of the government and sort of standard side of it. Thinking through what's become available through the laws that have already had an impact, like GDPR. One thing I haven't seen, and I kind of wanted to open to the group, but that I notice in human behavior, and I've done some experiments in myself with taking my data out and then recontextualizing it into new scenarios. For example, I scraped everything I ever wrote in my 20s and everything I ever said in my 20s and made it into a bot that like you can converse with. And it was really healing for me because it was like, oh, here's my past and it's in a body. And so I don't want to be a dick to another body. Something happens to you when you see another person. So changing the format of the data for me into something familiar was really powerful. And I feel like on the education side, what hasn't happened is like a visualization of people's data, even though it's become available to them. And I'm just sort of putting it to the group, like, what would it look like to stop worrying about the sort of data transactions and things like that and show people what data is already there for them, what data already exists in new. It's sort of, I know it's not like all the data that Facebook has, say, for example, but if I take everything out of Facebook, all my pictures and all the comments and everything are there. And what hasn't happened or what I haven't seen is someone giving me another place to look at that now that I have rights to it. And I'm just wondering if there's sort of something that could be done, or if anybody's seen anything in this way where we can use our rights to access to recontextualize as a means of education.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really, really cool idea. And that reminds me of a fantastic book called Data Feminism. If you were around yesterday, you may have heard the authors here, and they have a chapter in that book, or it's one of the principles of their book, The Data Feminism, to celebrate embodiment and to kind of change the stories we tell and experiment with the different kinds of stories we tell with and about data. So they do a lot of work on data visualization as well. And I think like the feminist ethics and feminist thinking has a lot to contribute in this. there's a term that I picked up from somewhere that I particularly enjoyed, which is this idea of a mosaic. Basically, it's a kind of counter to this age-old kind of I want to say male kind of thinking that's like epitomized by, for example, Kant and thinkers like him, that we need to have this one kind of monolith that like of an ethical theory that needs to explain everything, and this is how we understand it. But feminist ethics is thinking about how we can build kind of small contextual bits of the mosaic, which together can form something beautiful and comprehensive and also interoperable. Another like fad word has been on everyone's lips today. So instead of kind of and to really experiment the different forms and formats which data about us can take. So I think you make a really, really nice point there, Sam.
I'm gonna check out that book.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And it's open access. It's datafeminism.io. You can read it for free.
Nice. Thank you. So I saw an article that Vivi, that you shared in the general channel. And the article here, I'll share it in the chat. It actually goes about speaking about why these sorts of a trust mark is difficult to create. And I think if I understand correctly, at first glance, it seems like it's maybe going against what we are talking about with gold button, which we haven't really talked about in depth, I guess, but it's basically a minimal set of standards that that would ensure self-sovereign agents would be able to know what to build and develop against in order to become a part of the ecosystem. And from what I could tell in reading the article, I think it's the reason why they found it difficult is because of the different complexities of each sector. And so the question I would like to ask you, Vivi, is at least when it comes to human centricity, authentication, authorization, and auditing, these three do seem to be common across all different sectors. So would you see creating a trust mark or a standard or a set of standards that would make at least these three aspects interoperable, not just between sectors, but I think the goal is to make it interoperable throughout the whole world. Would that be in any way controversial or conflicting? And maybe also at this moment, maybe you could also talk about in the my data aspect as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think yeah, the thing by it was written by Laura James from Everyone, published last year, just over a year ago. So the question of kind of creating a trust mark or a certification for technology is more of a governance issue, and then the set of standards for minimum interoperability, for example, I think is a different issue. And these things do get conflated quite often. Just because there's a kind of set of standards for something, like it's not the same thing as having something certified as trustworthy or good tech or ethical tech and such. And I think that's what the Everyone article kind of points out, is that basically because technology evolves so rapidly, and I think, yeah, the slogan that they use is like technology isn't like bananas. sorry, I completely lost the train of my thought there.
Oh.
Yeah, so I think sort of like standards and certification of kind of quote unquote goodness of services and products are two things that we need to consider as separate issues. And I do think is like any kind of like ethical labeling of services and products is not only difficult, but also requires a really robust kind of governance mechanism, which is I think then different to the kind of mechanisms that are involved when we're defining interoperability standards.
I think it also makes a problem because you have things like B Corps where you're sort of ticking a bunch of boxes like, oh, do you give to charity and things like that, and it's like has nothing to do with the impact you directly have on your placement in the world and where you operate, right? And so it creates this kind of cap and trade of responsibility in a way, which doesn't end up, it kind of messes the world up a little bit more when you have somebody like Jeff Bezos like giving to kids in Africa instead of dealing with the homelessness problem in Seattle or things like that. And if you create these kind of standards that are like, hey, you know, this is what ethical looks like, but there's a million different places that it operates, it's like it kind of can create more problems than good in those cases.
Yeah, and I think this kind of like goes to one of the conversations that we had a little bit earlier with Adrian as well, is like about how do we conceptualize ethics? Is it something that can be kind of stamped, quantified, checklisted, compared against some standard, or is it more of a continuous engagement with and grappling with the consequences and the motivations of what are you doing with data and with technology? And I understand like the need for certain parts of for example, the product design process. There could be, you know, very good use made out of these kind of like ethical checklists, like at least, you know, check that, you know, your team is representative of the kind of people for whom you are designing this product, so that you're not building in inherent biases because of lack of inclusion and diversity and this kind of things. But in the grand scheme of things, like you can't outsource ethics. You can't kind of say that, you know, we have this ethics and compliance officer, or we have this ethics mark now, so therefore we're golden. But it has to be like an ongoing negotiation among all of your stakeholders, including your company employees, your customers, your funders, your board members, all of you.
Can you speak a little bit to the, oh, sorry, I just have a question about how the sort of watchdogs work in Europe versus here. Because in Canada, we have like a medium amount of watchdogs. And in the US, we have almost none. But I'm just wondering where those come from, because Europe's just like the best at it. And how, like, if you could speak a little bit to that, because it sounds like you know about it, I'm curious.
Watchdogs in terms of,
well, like people, like when we're talking about this, it's like, you know, like who watches who, right? It's like, it seems like in you know, in like Great Britain or in Canada, we have watchdogs for large corporations that you have an ombudsman that you can get in touch with. What is the sort of steps, or sort of, you know, it seems like my data is in a position to do something like that, to be an ombudsman, right? Sort of group where you become a trusted resource of intellectuals in the ethics space that will review cases for you. That to me seems like, as somebody who's like gone to the top of an ombudsman to get a phone bill thing and had somebody say like, you've been abused, you know, like that was a powerful experience for me as an independent consumer to have. And I think that when we look at communities like this, and the things that you're speaking about are so accurate and true, and you have such a good knowledge of it, like how can we flip these groups of experts into something like watchdogs?
Well, I think
I didn't mean to commandeer, sorry.
No, I think
Vivi,
Yeah.
just before you begin, I do want to note that we're almost at the end, and
Right.
so Vivi, as you, I think Sam asked a perfect question, because that is exactly the question that I wanted to ask you at the end. As you answer it, maybe you could also speak about the role that you think My Data should take, and in terms of making sure that we have an ethical personal data ecosystem for the world.
Right. So I think the theme of this conference, for example, is a perfect encapsulation of what I want to say. Like, My Data Online 2020 is about radical collaboration, and I think just having that we need to have trade associations looking at these issues. We need to have data protection officers in place, the regulators and the watchdogs, and we need to have civil society groups and consumer advocates, citizen advocates, individual people, as well as something that quite often gets unnoticed or unmentioned in these conversations is the media. They have an incredible amount of power, and we often, I've started to think about the BLT sandwich that we talk about in My Data as well, and how we need collaboration between the different kinds of sectors. And I found myself wondering, like, where's the media? Like, who, how can we, as My Data, for example, influence the media, who have such a wonderful and terrifying at times reach when it comes to shaping the way people think and approach things, and what they trust and what they're scared of as well. So maybe like I said, like, we can't outsource ethics from an organization or from society. We can't pigeonhole it in society either. Like, yes, we have academic ethicists who should be part of the discussion, but really the answer has to be collaboration. And in this time and age, that scale and kind of collaboration will necessarily be radical.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I really like the phrase that you said, that we can't outsource ethics. Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense, and it's a great saying. So we are past the hour, and I think officially we will end the session here. I do know that there's some people who want to say a few words still, so if you want to hang out, then please feel free to. Adrian, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one small point. Human centricity is very different from industry centricity. And in a lot of what happens, both in the governance and the standard sense, industry minimizes or diminishes or manipulates the human centricity part by taking the things that are truly not industry specific. They have nothing to do with healthcare differently than they do with commerce, than they do with finance. And these things are, Chris mentioned them, authentication, authorization, and audit. Those are standards and practices that are, like the notary, for example, that you go to. The notary doesn't care whether you're notarizing a healthcare document or a real estate lease or what was the third, your safety manual certification. And that is a human-centric perspective. But we are being manipulated by introducing industry by industry different silos, and some of it looks like, oh, we have to have interoperability or portability of, this particular aspect of the personal data store and things like that. And I think that is not human-centric in its own way. We need to separate out those things which cross industries from the ones that need to be done industry by industry.
Great, thank you. I want to give Neil a chance to speak. Neil, please go ahead.
The one thing that keeps coming back, and I'm having a discussion with somebody on what are the essential credentials you have to have in life, and you find that there's analogs in real life that are moving up to digital, and there's always been very strong controls over those things, and it struck me increasingly that we need people who have, like a lawyer, they know, that they have the ability, the understanding of all the implications of the data and all the implications of privacy, and they're also experts in identity related data. And we also have, as Adrian pointed out, the audit. Well, simple. You can't run a business without an account and a set of books and an audit, right? And a guarantee that you will be audited. In Canada, I've been audited twice by the federal government for my business, and that's just table stakes. Not because we were red flagging anybody. It's just table stakes. You cannot run a business and deal with money. So if you're dealing with privacy information right now, it's hey, nobody can look at what the hell I'm doing with the data. Well, if Google is subject to an annual massive audit of what they're doing with people's data, it might be a whole different story. So I think that's the reality, is because this is moving the personal data, and the implications of it have moved front and center. And it's really the future of using technology, at least information technology. And those, I think, are just going to be table stakes. We just haven't got there yet.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to give Alexis a moment to share your thoughts. Alexis, please.
Just generally, I think this conversation helps me contextualize, like, within the community's definitions of what self-sovereign identity really means versus what a lot of, I want to say, opportunists have repurposed this language outside of this bubble. And I just want to be encouraging of the people in this field to get at those entities that are repurposing this language as much as you can, be as vocal as you possibly can. If you care about data, if you care about the consumer, if you care about privacy, if you care about what proper principles look like, and if you built these principles, be as vocal as possible in these other spaces, because they need you there, and these checks and balances need to be made. Because outside of the bubble, I'm seeing a lot of opportunism of using the language of self-sovereign identity or self-sovereign agents, and that's not exactly what they're rolling out. It's usually like a biometric product that usually has some sort of like other implications besides what the promises of the original language was. So I want to see more of that, and I am seeing some of it, but I'm just continuing to tell people, to encourage people to keep speaking about that in those spaces, especially if they're partnering with other people and organizations. Different definitions will look different, and different definitions of privacy will look different depending on who you're talking to. So I just want to keep that same baseline going, and I'll be continuing to do my research on my end, and I hope to keep talking to people.
Great. That was a great call to action. I loved it. Great. Thank you so much, Alexis. I think our speaker, Olivier, are you, if you're still there, would you like to have a closing word, please? And then Kalia too. I think you're muted, Olivier.
Yeah, okay. So it was great tough discussion, concepts. I like this, of course. What I think is important is to education for organizations and people we talk to, and I fear sometimes that maybe the message is too complex, but we need this boiling place, boiling ideas place, and this agora. This is necessary. But to me, we've got to keep in mind that at some point we will have to explain it to people, to cities, governments, to companies, and find good stories. Maybe different stories, a few different stories, but good stories. And right now I'm trying to talk to cities, and I'm confronting models. And it's better if messages are expressed in a simple manner, even if it's a complex subject.
Great. So simplicity is important. Yeah, that's great. Another call to action. Kalia?
Sure, I'll just echo what I said in the talk that I gave in the first plenary, which is about these questions of governance. They need to be figured out, and you know, the separation of concerns and separation of duties, and who governs the folks who are governing. And we just have to keep talking through these questions. And I also declared myself a technology pragmatist and go out into the world and try to build things. But we need to, in the building of those things, be humble and really put in meaningful feedback loops so that what we're building can be improved and made accountable to the people that we're hoping to serve.
Great. Yeah, that was humility is important, and we want to make things that can be built upon. Great. Thank you very much, Kalia. I think we went through everyone. Maybe Vivi, one last word, and then we'll end.
Thank you. No, I think it's been a fantastic time having this conversation with all of you. I'm just my humble gratitude for each of you for being here, sharing from your point of view. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining and staying, and have a great rest of the conference.
Yeah, tomorrow it's the unconference, so come and we'll keep the conversation going.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Take
Thank
care.
you.